Okay, so today we're going to talk about one of a very interesting topic in construction, which is actually what I study more than any other materials, and that is about wood and indigenous building materials. Okay, so Philippines is well known for its wood. When the Americans came, in fact, the Americans at first tried getting wood from the Philippines, except that the problem was there was not so many um, lumber yards here. They have to put it up themselves, and then so they did one in Negros. It's the biggest, and it was also known internationally during the time. Except that after a while, it was burned down, and after when it burned down, so America decided to not rebuild the lumber industry and instead get wood from America and then bring it here. Because at that time there was such a demand for wood when they were building all the what we call the Gabaldon buildings, which we see nowadays, no? The American period buildings. So it's all made of wood. Now, that's a little history of wood in the Philippines, but looking at the definition of wood, we see here the tough fibrous cellular substance that make up most of the stems and branches of trees beneath the bark. So the tree itself is not the wood, but what's inside the tree after the bark, which is the wood that we're referring to. So it's a traditional building material. When we started making our own shelters, so we started with wood, and it's easy to work with, has durability and beauty. Beauty, yes. Durability can be questionable. For as long as wood is not in contact with water, then you don't have any problem. It can last for centuries. So, for example, I have been in Japan and look at their temples, which is still standing, you know, for a long time. And most of their temples are, I think, all their temples are made of wood. And then there's a great ability to absorb shocks, something that a concrete cannot do. When subjected to extreme shock, concrete tends to crack, but the wood can just it's more flexible. It cushions the crack, and then sometimes it's deformed, but sometimes it goes back to its original form. There's freedom from rust and corrosion, so that's not the problem. It has a different problem, which is the um, decay, no? And comparatively light in weight and adaptable to a countless variety of purpose. So it's safe to assume that all of you are familiar with wood in general. And so here we have a diagram showing all the parts of a tree, which you have to be very familiar with, okay, in terms of definition. So you have to know what the foliage means. So it's the totality of all the trees, all the leaves, and that part is called the crown. So you have the trunk, and then you have different types of roots, and then the bowl, which where we take the timber, and then of course the branches and the twigs, which comes after the branches. Okay. We might be referring to some of the terms here as we go along our lecture. Of course, like any other creations on Earth, trees belong to particular species. I will not bore you with the botanical lecture, just to show you where the wood that we will be discussing will come from. No? So we're more among the um, plant kingdom. So we have this. We're interested more on the seed plants, which are the spermatophytes, and then it is divided into two: gymnosperms and angiosperms. And under angiosperms, there is one species which is the coniferalis, which is the source of the softwood, and then the other side in the angiosperms, there are dicots, which is the source of hardwood. So basically, this is how they would look like. Um, Softwood looks like the pine trees are softwood, and then all the other trees. But in the next slide, we have a more broad, a specific definition or difference of the hardwood and softwood. So the leaves in hardwoods are broad, okay, and then in softwood they are needle-like because pine trees are softwood. Now that doesn't always apply to all the wood because I stay now in Bohol in Maribohok, and Maribohok is actually a tree, um, and the leaves are like pine trees. No, they're needle-like, but Maribohok tree is actually a hardwood. Okay, so there are exemptions. And then for seeds, the seed of hardwoods are covered, enclosed in an ovary, but while the softwood are naked cones. So you should be familiar with the cones that are used in Christmas decorations. So those are actually seeds. And in shedding, um, hardwood, they tend to shed during autumn, or equivalent in the Philippines would be probably around summer. So the trees fall off. But in among softwood, the trees remain. The tree remain green. The leaves remain. No? So it's always green. And then in terms of form, um, hardwood are deliquescent. They're like designed to absorb water, while the softwood are excurrent. So it's like the tree is designed to get rid of the wood. So they only need, the water. So they only need a few water. Here are some examples of hardwood: acacia, ash, yakal. Acacia is known in the Philippines. Ash is not much. I don't think we have this, but yakal is also very common in the Philippines. We also have eucalyptus, gemelina, mahogany, and then the rest are not common in the Philippines. Now, mahogany, although I mentioned it, it's very common. Actually, it is not endemic to the Philippines. It was brought here by the Americans. But then somehow it adapted to the um, environment. The only problem is there's a debate now on whether mahogany is really a good tree for our forest when we have to replant our forest, since it's not endemic. So then the other side of the debate says that it has already adapted, and also the environment has adapted to it. So it would be safe because mahogany has some features which actually repel some bird species, for example, or may not be compatible with other trees. So I have not yet encountered the study that resolve this dilemma. So right now, the DENR has decided to play it safe by specifying that when reforesting, we should make use of endemic species, and then they came out with a list. Okay, so it would be good if you search for that list, although that's not your assignment now. No? This for your own education. Most of the softwood are not popular in the Philippines except the pine tree. Okay, and pine tree is only abundant when the environment is of low temperature, no? In the highlands, in the mountains, especially in Baguio. Now, in terms of application in construction, so these are the typical wood which are used for post and other parts requiring strength and stability. So we're referring to all structural members: beams, um, joists, girders, rafters, trusses. So we make use of ipil, molave, tindalo, and yakal. Okay. Um, Molave is also locally known as tugas. And yakal is known for its bitter taste. Okay, not that you have to taste it, no, but it has a bitter sap which repels insects naturally. And yakal can be very, very hard um, if it is soaked in salt water for some time and then dried again. So salt water actually, for all of this, I think, including ipil, um, so the process of soaking them in salt water helps in strengthening the wood. For doors, windows, sashes, and stairs, so we make use of Banuyo, Giho, and Narig. Giho is more popular. It's my first time to hear about the two other species. Um, for door panels, sashes, and frames, Apitong, Red Lawaan, and Tangili. So Lawaan, that's how we pronounce it, but this is how we spell it. And Tangili, as far as I was told, Tangili is still a type of Lawaan, but more high grade. Um, and then maybe the difference only with Tangili and Red Lawan is that the color, no? Red Lawan is more reddish. And then door panels, we make use of almond and white lawaan. So white lawaan, in terms of strength, maybe is not as good as Tangili and red lawaan. Now, if you cut a tree across, you will encounter this type of profile. You will see the growth rings. But what's more important are the terms. So it's like it looks like the section of the earth. No? But you have the outer bark phloem and cambium, which is not important in our discussion. And normally when the lumber is made, these parts are removed. So what remains is the heartwood and the xylem or the sapwood. So these are the important parts that we have to consider. The properties of hardwoods, they are darker in color, they can easily decay, and they may be highly decayed and insect resistant, and may be difficult to dry, and may have a distinct odor, and then slightly higher weight per unit volume than softwood. Okay, so now if you cut again this time in a different direction, you will see here, uh, this is what you see, but the terms that we need to consider here are the sections. No? So the horizontal section is this part where which shows the growth rings, and then the tangential section is the part where you see only the sapwood, and then the radial section is the one that cuts across the center of the tree. So if you process a tree into usable wood, for us in construction, we call that a lumber. When it is sliced into boards, planks, etc. for commercial purposes. Okay, so lumber can come in two main forms. It's either rough, you just cut it, or surfaced or dressed lumber. Okay, when it has to be sliced to a specific dimension. Now, when you cut it, when it's rough lumber, it is still wet. Okay, so you have to dry it before you cut it further into specific sections. We'll talk about drying lumber later. But for dressed lumber, we have three types, and these are the terms that are used in the industry. S1S, S2S, and S4S. S means smooth, and um, the other S refers to the side. So sometimes you need only one side smooth. Other times you need only the opposite sides as smooth. But of course, most of the time you would need them all sides smooth. Okay. Um, I think by default, lumber yards make them S4S. It comes out more expensive, but then there people tend to, it's more flexible if you have S4S. Okay, so you don't have to bother with needing an S4S, but you only have S2S. So when they cut the ball into lumber, there are three types of cutting. Plain saw, plain sawing is just cutting in one direction, and then rift sawing is cutting like in radial position, and then quarter sawing is cutting also radially but aligned in each quarter. Okay, and then the type of grain that you see in final wood uh, will indicate how it was sown. I hope I was able to include a picture of that. No? But then the dimension lumbers have their particular names depending on how they are cut. I mean, depending on the size. So if you have a size or a thickness of 1 to 1.5, and then a width of 2 to 6, we call that strips. Okay, so that when you actually um, label your drawing, so you should call that strips. And then from 1 to 1.5 to and 8 inches, so we call that boards. And strips are used for lattices. So, for example, some slats for chairs in the furniture, it is very common. And boards are more used for siding materials, sometimes for floor. Um, we can also use some strips for floors, like 1x4 in tongue and groove. And then we have the planks, which are with a thickness of 2 inches to 5 inches, which are used for stairs, floor girders, roof girds, and trusses. And then dimension lumbers from 2 inches to 4 inches, and the width of 2 inches to 4 inches also. Then beyond that are called timbers, 5 inches to 5 inches and larger. Okay. Now I work in a restoration firm, not really a firm, but I have restoration projects. And so far, my experience in restoration is with wooden structures. So the wood used in the past are really big. Okay, so mostly timbers, um, especially the Gabaldon school buildings. So they really make use of the um, exact dimensions, specified by the architects. Right now, even architects would specify a substandard dimension because of the cost of wood. These are the terms used in construction when wood is applied in the construction in building. So this is a lot of terms, but you have to be very familiar with all of them. But I'll start with the bottom. For example, the sill plate is very important when you have to put um, when you have a concrete, and then you have concrete wall, and then you're going to continue it with the wooden frame. So you have to put first to lay down a horizontal wood along the edge of the concrete wall, the top of the concrete wall. But you cannot use any wood. So you have to use either yakal. So the first type of wood that we mentioned earlier, yakal, ipil, mulave, those type, because they are bitter, they're acidic, and so they can also take on the acid coming from the concrete. Okay, otherwise, if you use low quality wood in contact with concrete, the tendency is the contact point might decay. Okay, the acid in the concrete will eat up the wood. So that's very important. And then maybe in the building tech too, how all of these are arranged or constructed will be explained. But right now, I leave it up to you to familiarize yourself with how they are called. And it's important also for you to know how they are called in local terms. Um, there is a book, I think, on this. I will upload a link or the reference material so that you can familiarize yourself with the local terms. So commercial lumber is sold in lengths from 6 feet to 20 feet in increments of 2 feet. Okay, so you do not order wood that is 7 feet in length or 5 feet in length or even 11 feet. So when you make your estimates and you need say 10 and 3/4 feet, then you have to order 12 feet. Okay, so that's why it's important to design so that you maximize the the wood because you're constrained with this. And normally, when we specify wood, we still use the English system. So if you notice, I've been talking about feet and inches. Sorry. But when we calculate the cost and we specify the unit that we make use is a in terms of board feet. So you have to know how to compute this. Excuse me. Right. Okay, so the formula is really very easy. You have the thickness um, in inches, and then the width in inches, multiply them times the length in feet. So if I have a 2 by 2 by 8 um, number, so I multiply 2 by 2 and then multiply by 8. And then all of that you divide into 12. And then you get 1 board foot. Okay, so and then you multiply it with the number of wood that you're going to order. If I need 10 2 by 2 by 8, it's 2 by 2 by 8 divided by 12 and times 10. And then you have the equivalent in board feet. So the pricing is normally in board feet in lumber yards, but in hardware, sometimes they're already lumped into piece per piece. Because especially if you order something like what we call millwork, a molding, which already is processed by machine. So there's additional cost to the board foot material to requirement. Now, lumber is not without defects, and there's a lot of defects that we can encounter with lumber. So here it's illustrated, so I don't need to really explain it so much. The reason for all of this defect is that wood tends to move. Okay, so does not go around running, or walking, but it moves a little. It expands or contracts. I mentioned earlier that as long as wood is not in contact with water, then you're good. But when it is in contact with water, it tends to expand, and then when water evaporates, it shrinks again. So, and then if your wood is constantly exposed to this, so it goes in that pattern of expanding and shrinking all the time. And sometimes the wood itself cannot, depending on how much it is exposed. So what happens is that it does not only expand and shrink in one direction, sometimes it does that in two directions. So you'll end up with all of these forms, no, of the bow, the cup, and the crook, and then it sometimes splits. Um, Otherwise, it breaks. So some parts of the wood along the grain is weaker, so that the bonding gives way and then it splits when it expands. The nuts are, of course, a very natural defect because that's the point where there was a branch. and at that point it is also weak, a bit weak. Although sometimes if there's a way, it also gives beauty, no, in the pattern of the wood. So what we do is that we season lumber um, to get rid of the water. Um, so here I said moisture has a big influence on the behavior and property of wood. So when a tree is cut, the moisture contained within it makes wood susceptible to insects and fungi attack and warping. So if the moisture content of wood is between 12% to 16%, it is resistant to decay and will not usually rot. This happens when the vapor pressure on the wood surface balances with the vapor pressure in the air. This is known as equilibrium moisture content. How do you measure the moisture content of the wood? There's actually a device that is used for it. So you the device is handheld and it has two prongs, no, like two metal prongs, and then you pierce it through the wood a little, and then it calculates the moisture content. To maintain the EMC of wood, seasoning of lumber is needed. So seasoning is the process of removing moisture from green wood. So the moment you cut wood, it is still considered as green. So rough lumbers are considered green. So there's a lot of water content inside. So the advantage of seasoned lumber is that it minimizes the attack of fungi and wood-boring insects, because the fungi and insects are, of course, attracted to water. Then the weight is reduced because you remove the water, and then the strength is increased, and then there's minimal shrinkage, checking, and warping. And then it will also increase nail holding power of wood. Therefore, if you make use of rough wood for construction, especially for um, let me see, these shanties that you see in low-cost construction in among socialized housing. So it's very easy to remove the, the parts of the houses, no, even if it's nailed. And then it improves the application of paint. There are two ways to season lumber. The traditional one is you dry it. So you stack it, arrange it in a certain manner, and leave it outside, exposed to the air. Of course, you have to protect it from rain, but the sides, the air should flow along with, hopefully, um, evaporate, evaporating the air, the water inside the wood. But the common process nowadays is called kiln drying, or KD. Okay, it's the process of removing excess moisture in wood by using warm, moist air or superheated steam in a kiln or oven. Okay, so this is not, well, there are like small kiln drying machines, but normally these are very big, and you put in a lot of lumber inside for kiln drying. So these are examples of how they look like, air drying and kiln drying. In the Philippines, we don't really do this type of stacking. Most of the time, it's like they form a letter A or an inverted V. So, and then in the Philippines also, we don't really have this sophisticated machine like the kiln drying here, which has two units. Normally, we only have one because it's a bit expensive and difficult to maintain. So we need to support the wood, no? Because it is also susceptible to decay, insect attacks. So we have wood preservatives and wood treatment. The most common locally is creosote, or otherwise known as acete, acete. I'm not sure about the spelling, so I'm sorry. So, but that's how the locals call it. So it's like it's actually tar um, which you thin with gas and then you apply. Okay, the idea is to make the wood bitter so that the insects are repelled. So you have oil-borne and water-borne, and you also have fire retardant. So there is a way to make the wood resist fire only for some time, not permanently. Okay, so at a certain time, heat can penetrate even the chemicals. So that's the time that the wood is burned. We've been talking about wood, but in the industry, there are also very common materials which were derived from wood, and one of them is plywood. So this is processed already. Common thickness is 3/4, but it comes in thicknesses of 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and 1 inch. 1 inch is the biggest. Handy panel. It's handy for well paneling and hobby boards. So it does not move. So that's the big advantage of plywood. You don't have the problem of movement. Um, the edges though are problematic and should be covered. So if you cut it, normally the edge is a bit frayed, and even if you sandpaper it, it does not become smooth. That's why it is very important that when you in constructing, especially when you're doing cabinetry and furniture, that if the edge of the that that you have to cover the edge of the plywood with a hardwood or a solid wood, okay, or lumber. So um, there are in the industry sometimes you can also make use of plastic, and there's one even that is like a sticker as long as you cover it. But traditionally, you cover it with a strip of wood, which is the same dimension, so that it's very clean. Okay, we call that edging. In the local terms, they call it liston. Okay, so and I noticed a lot of carpenters or wannabe carpenters who miss this out, making use of plywood for the cabinet face, for the cabinet doors, but not covering the edges of the wood. So that the another problem if you do not cover this is that water can easily seep in at the edges. Okay, and then that that deteriorates the wood faster. MDF is another, but this is more processed and it's commonly used in knockdown furniture. So if you buy knockdown furniture in the department store, or if you order a kitchen, which is already like um, it's a DIY kitchen type of furniture. So it's made up of the MDF. There are two types of MDF. One is more resistant to water, then the other one it's not so. They're usually covered with laminate or veneer, and sometimes they're specified on the type of veneer. For example, if you look at the picture here, the darkest one, so they call it wenge, and then I think the one at the bottom is the oak, and then you have uh, walnut somewhere here. I think the next after the wenge is walnut. So there are specifications. Anyway, normally if you go shopping for MDF, they have all of these brochures, and then you can look at the pictures and then specify from there. Now, this is a term that you have to be familiar with, millwork. Okay, so millwork is any type of woodwork that is produced in a mill. Mill is like a processing machine. Okay, so if the wood goes through that, then that that wood or that component is part of millwork. So I wrote down here some examples: doors, moldings, trims, flooring, wall paneling, and crown molding. They're all millwork. Okay. Otherwise, they are carved because they are done manually by hand. So carving is not only statues, but you can make a molding by carving. And sometimes it is done by craftsmen who are afraid to use the machines or are not used to it, or simply because what they need to do is very short, no? And then it's not practical to use the machine. Another term is called casework. Now, if you have to do something which is boxed, normally rectangular, so that's already casework. So examples are bookcases, chests, desks. So a desk is like a box also. Um, and then display cases and kitchen cabinets. Now, let's go back to casework. Um, Kitchen cabinets, for example, are not purely casework. So because you might need to put in the moldings, the crown moldings, the baseboard, some trimmings. So you also need the products of millwork to form the cabinet. So don't think that, okay, if it's casework, cabinets, so no millwork in cabinets. It applies to all of these examples. Now, indigenous materials. Um, these are materials which we gather or source locally, and the most common is abaca. Um, how to use abaca in construction? So normally they're not used for structural uh, construction unless there's someone who makes a research on it. But before, they can make use of abaca for um, for example, to replace steel steel matting in slab, especially for walls. There is a time that when concrete was not yet invented, that the walls can be made of mud, and to hold them in place, so you can use abaca. But abaca can be made into different materials, specifically ropes. And then the ropes, again, can also be used in any way in construction, especially as accessory. Coconut shell. So to give an example of how coconut shell is used in construction, you just research on the Coconut Palace designed by Maniosa, architect Maniosa. Coconut Palace, I wonder if you're familiar with it. It's in Manila. It's well known. It was designed by Maniosa when the Pope was coming to the Philippines, and that was supposed to be his residence. But then I think the Pope decided not to go there because it's so lavish. So now it's a tourist destination. Bamboo, of course, is very, very common. Um, and I'm sure that you've encountered how bamboo is used in many ways. They can be used structurally. Um, if, for example, you're building a bahay kubo, and that's why it's been given the moniker of poor man's lumber. So there's a lot of research right now on how bamboo can be further used in modern construction. Sometimes, at some point, it can be applicable as reinforcement to walls in replacement to steel. And then there are other byproducts of bamboo, like there's a plywood made of bamboo. And then you can even make a pipe made of bamboo, but not directly. It's like laminated bamboo, but pipes. Rice hull ash, I'm not very familiar with this, but it seems to be common. Okay, so that's it. Um, so I have a homework for you, which is due on September 6th at midnight, 11:59 p.m. So um, I will post them in Google Classroom after this lecture. So all you need to do is to search for three suppliers of the following products. Dimension lumbers, kiln-dried plywood, MDF, bamboo, and abaca. And then you give the name of the company or individual, then the address and contact numbers. So limit your search to Cebu province only. Don't include Manila, Davao, or even islands in the Visayas. And submit in Word format. Okay, so I think that's it. No? Um, let's see if there are questions.
Sir,
Yes.
how about for the other students who doesn't live in Cebu, like Northern Samar?
Oh, um, that's a good point. Um, so maybe I'll change that to the city where they live or the province where they live. Okay,
Okay.
so there are
Sir,
yes.
question. Do we have any font or font size specifications for the assignment? It was in the chat.
The font, no, actually, but let's stick to something normal like Roman times or the usual in
Uh,
Word, the Calibri. So don't use too much fancy letters.
okay, sir. And do we write our names in the file?
Yes, yes, you have to. You have to. Although when I check it, it's in the I check it from the computer, but you have to write the names.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
A question, sir.
Yes,
Uh, your instruction, three suppliers, is that three suppliers for each type of wood?
yes, three suppliers for each.
Each type of wood.
No, I gave a list. So for each of them, for example, for the dimension number in general. So even if they don't have all the types of the sizes of lumbers, as long as they sell dimension lumbers, so give three suppliers for bamboo, three suppliers for plywood. So it might happen that the supplier for plywood is the same as the dimension number, so you have to write them again.
So
Okay,
pwede
so
balik-balik, sir.
yes, yes.
Sige. Thank you, sir.
There is a question about who tasted the sap. Can you taste the sap? You just try it and then tell me how it tastes. So some of you are familiar with the kapalton. That's very good. So why is kiln drying more advantageous than air drying? Um, I think there's a yeah. I did not write a slide on it, but the main reason is that it's faster. Air drying will takes you so many months, and kiln drying will only take you a little more than a month. So I think like kiln drying takes you only a little more than a month, but air drying takes you like 3 to 6 months. And then also air drying is not so reliable because the weather is not consistent. So kiln drying, the environment is controlled. No? Even the heat is controlled. So you would expect to you would expect a more consistent also product. Okay.
Sir, na ako'y question.
Yes, Ryan.
Kanang, di ba, there's such thing as laminated timber, sir?
Laminated timber. Yes, I did not include that yet because it's advanced material. And I don't know if we have it here in the Philippines. I think we need to order that from
From abroad.
abroad.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm not also familiar with its strength capability, but that's a good point. I might mention it in our next meeting. Try to read up on it because I'm not familiar with the material.
Sige,
But
sir.
there's a lot of people already making use. For example, um, um, I was thinking of, for example, steel beams. Instead of using steel beams or I-beams, they make I-beams made of wood. And sometimes what they use are laminated timber.
Sige, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so I promise it's my homework. So any more questions? Sir, is synthetic wood cheaper than natural wood? Um, Let me see. The answer is no. So because the synthetic wood. So there's I have two understanding of this word. One is that it is wood processed, like plywood is not really solid wood, so it's a processed wood. So it's made into plies um, and then made into board. I consider that also synthetic. But the other way of calling synthetic wood is that you have a different material which you make to look like wood. So in both cases, I think it is more expensive. Although I'm not very sure about the other one, no? The new material, because there's extra processing involved. So I'm thinking of, but you know how the world works, no? If it becomes too mass produced, so the tendency is that maybe the cost will also go down and then it comes up the same. But to make use of plywood compared to hardwood laminate, for example, if you need a tabletop, you can use plywood, so not that's a problem. But you can also use boards, and then you put them side by side. Okay, so whether the cost is the same, I think still the plywood comes out expensive. Okay, so some of you are answering each other's question. That's very good. And then yes, you can search in Google, especially that you cannot go out of your houses. Um, Normally, they have, especially nowadays, they have the websites. They come up with websites, and you have to be familiar with the suppliers because later on you will be needing that when you need to call them for prices. In some other classes of the same course, some other group, I think the assignment is to look for prices of products. Now that's I decided to change it to suppliers because eventually you will be calling them for prices when you make your estimates in higher building tech. Okay, so no need to do that at this point, but it's important that you know who to call, where to call.
Sir,
Yes.
there's a question raised sa chat box, sir, bang she lives in another country. So what
Oh,
if
that's which country?
Saudi Arabia na, sir?
Ah, that's unusual. Um, I guess it applies to that. She has to, or he uh, has to consider where she or he lives, that province in Saudi Arabia. So, do they have hardware? Of course, they have. No, they're more advanced. So that's my answer. So
Thank you,
I
sir.
missed that in the chat box. No?
Sir,
Yes.
I have a question. I'm from Zamboanga City kasi sir, kapag,
Hmm.
I mean, pwede i-include yung Zamboanga del Sur or yung ibang places ng Zamboanga, ang ibang areas? Or,
But Zamboanga City belongs to which province?
um, del Sur, sir.
Del Sur, yes. So the whole of Zamboanga del Sur is your source.
Pero I can include din po, sir, ang Zamboanga Sibugay or not? Or Zamboanga del Sur lang talaga as it is?
Okay, if you're forced um, to specify source outside your province, then please put a note why. Maybe it's not at all available in your province, so you can put a note. Because I can easily search also from here. You know, that you're specifying outside your uh, province. Is that okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay.
Na
So
question, sir.
yes.
Is soaking wood into salt water applicable for any types of wood?
Yes. Although it's hardly used now as a process, except in the countryside maybe, because it takes longer. So what they do is that they use additives. So they just they they cut it first before they apply additives to or yeah, they apply chemicals to protect it from dry from termites and rats. So before you have to soak it, like you treat it first before you cut it. So now the process is changed. So it's very funny because when I talk to you, I look at the icon. So I should be looking at the camera. So I'm not used to it. Anything else? Anyway, I think we need to end because I don't want the video recording to be very long. But you can continue asking questions through, of course, the Google Classroom. Then I'll try to answer them as soon as possible. So thank you very much for participating. There are 47 of us now, including myself, of course. And see you next time. And wait for the assignments to be uploaded, as well as the notes and the recording. Okay, so good morning to everyone.
Good morning,
Thank you,
sir.
sir. Good morning, sir.
Morning, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Sir.